The next topic we're going to cover is the cardiovascular system. In the cardiovascular system, we're going to talk about the first topic in the cardiovascular system is cardiac physiology. So we're going to talk about the structure and function of the heart itself, and then once that's complete, we're going to talk about the hemodynamics and the circulatory system and some functional properties about that. So in general, just as an overview, in the cardiovascular system, if we start in systemic circulation, relatively deoxygenated blood is returned to the heart, to the right side of the heart, from systemic veins. The blood enters the right side of the heart. It then moves into the pulmonary circulation in order to pass through pulmonary capillaries and become oxygenated. Oxygenated blood then returns to the heart, to the left side of the heart, and is then pumped into systemic circulation, into systemic arteries. That oxygenated blood then perfuses organs throughout our body at the level of systemic capillaries. As we'll talk about later in the circulatory system, our capillaries are our sites of exchange between blood and tissue. And they are, by and large, our only sites of exchange between blood and tissue. Okay? And the rest of the vessels of the circulatory system are designed to either carry blood to those capillary beds or away from those capillary beds. So if we look at what path blood takes as it moves through the heart, as I said before, blood enters the heart into the right side of the heart from our systemic veins. And the veins that feed the heart include the inferior and superior vena cava. And blood enters from the superior and inferior vena cava into first the right atrium. Okay? And this dotted circle is meant to represent the entry of blood from those veins. From the right atrium, blood passes through the right atrioventricular valve, or AV valve, into the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, blood then moves up into the pulmonary arteries, passing through the pulmonary valve. From the pulmonary arteries, blood enters the pulmonary circulatory system. It passes through pulmonary capillaries, becomes oxygenated, and then returns to the heart through pulmonary veins that you can see on either side of the heart here. Blood moves from the pulmonary veins into the left atrium, and then blood moves from the left atrium through the left AV valve into the left ventricle. And from the left ventricle, the blood then moves past the aortic valve and into the aorta and the aortic arch. So this is the path that blood takes as it moves through the heart. The heart contains valves that lie between the atria and ventricles, and also between ventricles and arteries. Okay? So there you will find valves in the heart in between atria and ventricles and arteries. You will not, however, find valves between veins and atria. That's the only place where in the heart where you're not going to find valves. Okay? And heart valves are very, very strong structures that are designed to ensure that blood flows in a single direction, okay, and does not allow blood to flow back in the opposite direction. So the valves that we find between atria and ventricles, okay, include the two that we're looking at right here in this slide. On the right side, we're looking at the right atrioventricular valve, or AV valve, which is also sometimes called the tricuspid valve. And it's called the tricuspid because, as you can see, there's three leaflets, right? There's three cusps to this valve. And on the left side, we've got the left AV valve, also called the bicuspid valve or the mitral valve. Okay? Two cusps sitting between the left atria and the left ventricle. And so what you can see is from this aerial view, and this is the view that you might see if you're looking down from the atria. Okay? So what we have is a relatively strong ring of cartilage, a strong ring of tissue here that prevents this valve from collapsing. And then we see we've got these leaflets, and these leaflets are folded inwards. So where we're looking at is where blood would enter through this valve. Okay? And if we look at a side view of the mitral valve, the right AV valve, or the tricuspid valve, what we see is we were looking in from this right atria. So these leaflets are pointed into the ventricular space, and they are very strongly anchored to the ventricular muscle. Okay? There are these cords of tendon that we call chordae tendineae that attach these leaflets to these muscles called papillary muscles that are attached to the ventricular muscle. Okay? So the purpose of this is as blood fills the ventricle, okay, blood is going to fill this ventricle from the right atrium, and eventually this ventricle is going to start to contract. As it starts to contract, pressure builds up in this ventricular space, okay, and it's the blood that's in the ventricular space is going to stay in this ventricular space. It's not going to move back into the right atrium because these leaflets are going to lock into place and prevent this backflow of blood. Now the valves are critically important because when this ventricle contracts, okay, the purpose of contraction of this ventricle is to make blood move from the ventricle into an artery, and in this case, blood is going to move from the right ventricle into the pulmonary artery. Okay? So we want to make sure that all of the energy that we're using to contract this muscle is going to be used to make blood move into that pulmonary artery. And if any blood were to backflow into the right atrium, that represents wasted energy that contracted the muscle and blood moved in the wrong direction. Okay, so these valves are absolutely critical in order to maximize all the energy used to contract muscle in the heart in order to move blood in the direction that we want it to move in. Okay. Now the valves that you find between ventricles and arteries, okay, look slightly different. So what we're looking at here is the valve that you would find between the left ventricle and the aorta. Okay, so this is the aortic valve. So what we find that's different about this is that the leaflets are more like true cusps. Okay? They form little cups, so to speak, okay? That when this valve shuts, the blood actually fills these little cusps and seals off this valve. Okay? So the blood actually participates in sealing off this valve. Okay? That's the design of it. Okay? But the purpose is the same. As pressure builds up in this aorta and you now get pressure of blood against the valve wall, the sealing off of this valve prevents blood from moving back into the ventricular space. So if we look back at the heart placement and structure, the heart contains, like we saw with the pulmonary tissue with the lungs, the heart contains a series of serous membranes that covers its exterior. The serous membranes, if you recall, are these sheets of connective tissue that also produce fluid. And we find serous membranes on the outside of organs and also lining the interior of body cavities. And the purpose of serous membranes is it's a protective membrane It produces fluid that reduces frictional forces. And so we see two sets of serous membranes associated with the heart. Together we call these serous membranes the pericardial sac. The membrane that we find that is against the heart tissue, okay, the one that directly lies against the heart, we call that the epicardium. Okay, that is the name for that serous membrane, is the epicardium. And then the second serous membrane that's on the outside, we call the pericardium. These two membranes produce fluid that fills the space in between them. Okay? The space in between them we call the pericardial cavity, and the fluid we call pericardial fluid. Okay? And all together we call this the pericardial sac. And so the purpose of the pericardial sac, there's several purposes. An important purpose is, again, to reduce frictional forces. So when the heart is beating, it beats and generates a significant amount of force. And so this pericardial sac, among other things, is reducing the frictional forces of the heart against any of the other structures in the thoracic cavity. Now, if we look at the microstructure or the cellular structure of cardiac muscle, okay, the predominant cell type that makes up the heart, cardiac muscle is a very special category of muscle tissue. We have three types of muscle tissue in our body. We've got skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. So cardiac muscle has its own category. And what defines cardiac muscle, okay, or defining features, anatomical features, include that cardiac muscle is a type of muscle that we call striated. And the striations are these linear lines. In this cartoon here on the left, the striations are these linear lines that you see along the muscle cell. And the striated pattern that you see in cardiac muscle is actually intracellular proteins that organize themselves in a particular pattern, and they are responsible for generating the force when a muscle contracts. Okay? And when it's organized in this pattern that creates these visual lines, it's called striated. Skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle are striated muscle. Smooth muscle is not. Okay, so that's the distinction. Another defining feature of cardiac muscle is that it has a particular shape. Okay? Each cardiac muscle cell has a particular shape. So in this cartoon here, a single muscle cell, the boundary of this single muscle cell, over here is the nucleus of the cell, and then these gray lines here represent the boundary of this one individual cell. So this cell has a branched pattern to it. Okay? This cell has a branching pattern to it. This branching pattern you don't see with skeletal muscle, and you don't see with smooth muscle. So that's a defining feature of cardiac muscle. And then the last defining feature of cardiac muscle, at least on a gross scale, is these gray lines that I was referring to. So these gray lines are called intercalated discs. No other muscle tissue in our body have intercalated discs. And you can see in this slide showing actual cardiac muscle, we can see these intercalated discs. Right? Now, what they are, they attach one cardiac muscle cell to the next cardiac muscle cell. It allows cardiac muscle cells to attach to each other and sort of line up. Now, these intercalated discs are critically important for the function of cardiac muscle. Okay? So it is the attachment point for one cardiac muscle to its neighboring cardiac muscle cell, rather. So if we take a closer look at what one of these intercalated discs look like, okay, what we're going to find are two key structures that are located in these intercalated discs. Number one, we find a protein anchor called a desmosome. Okay? A protein anchor called a desmosome. And these desmosomes, the purpose of these desmosomes is to physically anchor, physically attach one cardiac muscle cell to the next. So you can see that the protein is structured in such a way that it anchors and attaches one cardiac muscle cell to the next. The other thing that you will find in intercalated discs are gap junctions. So when we talked about communication between neuronal cells, we talked about electrical synapses. Well, we find gap junctions, electrical synapses, between muscle cells in the heart, between cardiac muscle cells in the heart, which means that an action potential or a depolarization in one cardiac muscle, okay, is going to diffuse across into the next cardiac muscle. Okay. So when we have gap junctions between cells, that's sometimes referred to as two cells being electrically coupled, because what happens in one cell is going to immediately happen in the next. Okay. So the purpose of these intercalated discs is that it allows these cardiac muscle cells to be physically anchored and also to be electrically coupled. Okay. So when an action potential is triggered and a muscle contraction is triggered in one cardiac muscle cell, it rapidly spreads to the next. And it's going to basically allow these neighboring muscle cells to contract all at once and to act as a single unit. Okay? And that's going to be very important as we talk about the mechanical events of that encompass one cardiac cycle, which represents one heartbeat.